I think the driving force of the squatters movement in this neighborhood was that people wanted to live here, that they felt this was the community they wanted to be in. They felt comfortable here. People feel comfortable here for a lot of different reasons. White people from middle-class backgrounds who didn't fit in feel comfortable here because they don't feel judged by middle-class standards. A lot of African American people have told me they feel comfortable here because they could, for instance, have, a white boyfriend or a white girlfriend and no one would judge them, and they can live their life the way they want to. Gay people come here feeling that, they will not be judged for being gay. A lot of Hispanic people feel, particularly people who are born here, feel that this is their neighborhood. They don't see why they should have to live someplace other than where they were born. So there are a lot of different reasons, but for all those reasons, people felt that being here was really desirable, and they were willing to make effort and make sacrifice to do that. There were clearly people with a strong ideological bent who played a major role in the squatters movement. I think that's true of any social movement. The majority of people were not like that. The majority of people had personal and practical reasons for wanting to live here. And had they been offered an affordable rent somewhere, they probably would have taken it, but they weren't being offered affordable rents. And I know that there's some people who have an ethic about living free or living off the grid. I think that was a real minority in the community here. And in fact, those people didn't always fare that well because other people expected them to work, other people expected them to put in money. And, so somebody who saw the squats as a chance to live without working very often was very disappointed in how that worked out for them. So there was this older gentleman who lived in our building, who'd been living on the street. He'd been making his living by collecting scrap metal, cans and whatever, and selling to recycling companies. And he was an older Southern sort of black guy with a very heavy accent, spoke, country black English, Old South country black English. And it was sort of understood that if he were to go out and get a job, it would not be a very dignified job. And he happened to have enormous experience with construction work. He'd done construction work all his life. And so it was agreed he could, do 2 days a week instead of one. And a lot of what he did in those 2 days was instructing other people on the right way to do things. So that I thought was a really good arrangement. Another arrangement was there was a guy in the building who had a tendency not to take care of himself. Like if he made some money, he ran out, went to a rock concert, and had no money. And, he was found one day freezing, on a really cold day with no jacket and no heater in his room. Because he hadn't bought a coat and he hadn't bought a heater, and he just didn't care about these things. He got high and listened to music, said to hell with it. And people said, well, here's the deal. You can take your month's rent and buy a heater with it, and you can take your month's rent and buy a coat with it. And things like that, I think were sort of the squats working at their best, where, because these people knew you, they could accommodate you if they liked you. Or there were people who, did make a fair amount of money. They said, you can take 2 spaces and pay extra money, and you can take off some work days and pay extra money, and that way, we can accommodate you for that. So that's really where they were at their best, which is that everything was on a very personal basis. It was, you knew these people, you had a relationship with this group. Where I think it went badly is if people didn't like you for whatever reason, that they could be very judgmental and very harsh and very unjust, and that because there were no legal processes, the way you deal with any problem is you move the guy out forcibly. And so that could be kind of rough. Okay, people had to negotiate who was doing what work. Some people were far more inclined to work on things than others. People had to negotiate security concerns. For instance, at one point in time, our electricity was illegal. So there had to, anytime anyone used electricity, there had to be, a black cloth over the window. There were people who were careless about that. That had to be worked out. They had to be made aware that they couldn't do that. People had to decide who was moving in and who wasn't. People had to deal with, if somebody was abusive or violent, people would have to deal with that. We had a stated position that nobody was allowed to use hard drugs. There were always, just as there is in the larger society, there were always real anomalies in the enforcement of that. I mean, some people get away with, some people don't get away with, enormous hypocrisy and disagreement about that. It's a problem the whole society has. And we had it too. Only there was always the feeling that things would be extra hard for us if things went badly, because this was an illegal situation and, the police could come in at any time, and do you want something here that will put you in greater danger? And of course, there were no legal rights, so that, those things could be decided by people. People decide so-and-so's a drug dealer, let's go get the baseball bats and get him out of here. There were also some people who found it a very convenient place from which to deal drugs in certain buildings, and who eventually, as the buildings legalized, had to leave. So I think there were some people who were against legalization for exactly that reason. So, there were a lot of tensions, that had to be resolved. Well, there were like weekly meetings that went on way into the night and involved a kind of consensus process. Some of those meetings got pretty intense, and I also should stress that there were lots of different types of buildings with lots of different arrangements. Some buildings didn't have meetings. Some buildings had more democratic process than others. But yeah, people had to make a decision about how they were going to run things. And I actually think, although that was a really difficult process and it became overwhelming to me at a certain point, I think the idea of whether it's a squat or a tenant union or a block association or whatever it is, the idea of people getting together to make decisions about their lives rather than having those made by some distant authority is educational to people. They grow from that process. They discuss things, they learn how to get along together or fail to. But I think actually the difficulty we have with it stems from the fact that we weren't brought up doing it. And it's very hard for us to learn how to negotiate our differences with our next door neighbor, with people in our immediate environment. And probably aggravated by the fact that this is a city and people are very diverse, and so the person you're dealing with may have a very different way of looking at the world than you do. But I think it's a process that people are going to have to learn to find their way through. And that, before we can really have a society that's democratic, people are going to have to be able to do that, as difficult as it is.